The small town was quiet that afternoon. Clouds hung low, and the wind carried the smell of rain through the open windows of a small house at the edge of town. Inside, a woman named Linda stood by the sink, washing dishes while her old radio hummed softly on the counter. It was one of those radios that crackled more than it played music, but she kept it on all the time. The sound comforted her. It reminded her of her husband, David, who had once been a pilot in the Air Force. It had been almost 6 years since his plane disappeared during a rescue mission over the mountains. They said the weather was too bad, that the storm came in faster than expected, and that no one could have survived the crash. But Linda never got to see his body. All they gave her was a folded flag and a few belongings. Something inside her refused to believe he was gone. Every evening, she turned on the radio and listened to the frequencies near the airbase, hoping, without saying it out loud, that maybe, somehow, she would hear his voice again. Her teenage son, Noah, had grown up watching her do this. He didn't really understand it at first. He was only 8 when his father disappeared, and memories of him were blurry now, mostly laughter, a strong voice, and a pair of hands lifting him up in the air. But even if he didn't remember every detail, he missed the idea of having his father around. The radio had become part of their routine, a small piece of hope they both carried quietly. That day, the rain started to fall harder. Linda dried her hands and walked to the window, watching the drops race down the glass. The air smelled fresh but heavy. In the background, the radio hissed with static. She didn't pay much attention at first until she heard something different. A faint click, then a voice. "This is Captain D. Hayes. If anyone hears this, tell my family I'm alive." Linda froze. Her heart skipped a beat and her hands started to shake. She turned toward the radio, not sure if she really heard what she thought she did. The sound came again, faint but real, buried under layers of static. "This is Captain D. Hayes. Tell my family I'm alive." Her knees felt weak. She turned the volume knob up slowly. "David?" she whispered. The room felt smaller, tighter, like the air had been sucked out of it. She leaned closer to the speaker, pressing her hand to her mouth. The signal faded, then returned for a few seconds before disappearing again. Noah ran into the kitchen, alarmed. "Mom, what happened?" he asked, seeing her pale face and trembling hands. I heard something," she said softly. It was your father's voice. Noah frowned, confused. "The radio?" "Yes," she said, pointing to it. "He said he's alive." Noah stared at the radio, then at her. "Mom, are you sure? Maybe it was a recording or a show." "No," she interrupted. "It was him. I know his voice. I'd know it anywhere." They both stood in silence as the radio continued to hum with static. Linda waited, hoping the voice would return, but it didn't. After a few minutes, she sat down at the table, her heart racing. It couldn't be real, she thought. It just couldn't. But it felt real. That night, she barely slept. Every sound in the house made her jump. She replayed the moment over and over in her mind. The tone of his voice, the way he said the words. There was fear in it, but also strength. It wasn't a ghost or an echo. It felt alive. The next morning, Linda called the Air Force office where David had been stationed. She explained what she had heard, carefully describing the message. The officer on the other end was polite but skeptical. He told her it was probably an old transmission, maybe interference from a weather signal or a recording loop that sometimes plays on abandoned frequencies. But when she asked if they could check, the man sighed and said there was no active search or record of any signal like that. "Ma'am," he said gently, "I know it's hard, but sometimes these things just happen. Static can play tricks." She hung up the phone, frustrated and angry. It wasn't static. It wasn't a trick. She knew what she heard. For the next few days, Linda stayed near the radio every evening. She tuned through the frequencies carefully, her ear close to the speaker. Noah began helping her, writing down times, numbers, and any small noises that sounded different. It became their shared mission. They didn't tell anyone else, not yet. Linda didn't want people to think she was losing her mind. One night, just as they were about to give up, it happened again. The same voice, the same message. "This is Captain D. Hayes. If anyone hears this, tell my family I'm alive." But this time, there was something new at the end. A faint sound, maybe coordinates, maybe just static, but Linda was sure there were numbers. She quickly grabbed a notebook and wrote down everything she could before it faded away. The next morning, They took the recording to a man who used to fly with David. He lived a few towns over and had retired years ago. His name was Henry. He invited them in, and when he heard the voice, he went silent. His eyes widened and his face turned pale. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. "From my radio," Linda said. "It came through twice this week." Henry listened again, leaning close. "That's not a recording," he murmured. "Listen to the background, those are modern frequency codes. They weren't even used when David's plane went down." Linda felt her heart leap. "So it's real?" Henry nodded slowly, still staring at the speaker. "It's real, but I don't know how. Maybe it's bouncing from an old transmitter. Maybe it's something else. But this isn't old data." Noah's eyes lit up. "So he could still be out there?" Henry looked at him, hesitant. If this is recent, it means someone or something just sent it. They left Henry's house with more questions than answers, but also with a tiny spark of hope. For the first time in years, Linda felt alive again. That night, she sat on the porch with the radio beside her, listening to the quiet night sky. The stars were hidden behind clouds, but she kept looking up, imagining him somewhere out there, still trying to reach home. When Noah came outside, she smiled weakly. "You think I'm crazy, don't you?" He shook his head. "No, Mom, I think maybe you were right not to give up." She reached for his hand and squeezed it. "Your dad was the kind of man who wouldn't stop until the job was done. If he's trying to reach us, we'll find him." The rain began again, soft and steady. The radio crackled once more, a whisper of static like a breath from far away. Linda closed her eyes, listening closely, every part of her hoping, praying, waiting for the voice to return. Even though it didn't, she knew deep down that something had changed. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt like the start of something. And that night, for the first time in 6 long years, she smiled through her tears. The next morning started quietly, but something about the air felt strange, too still, too heavy. Linda sat by the window with a cup of coffee, staring out at the street where nothing much ever happened. The radio on the table played its usual morning news, the voice of the announcer drifting softly through the room. She had grown used to that sound over the years. It kept her company when the silence of the house felt too big. Noah, her son, was still asleep upstairs. He was 13 now, tall for his age, with the same brown eyes as his father. Every time she looked at him, it was like seeing a piece of the past walking in front of her. The same smile, the same stubborn chin. It hurt and healed her at the same time. She glanced at the framed picture on the shelf, her husband in his pilot uniform standing next to his jet with that confident grin he always had before a flight. It had been 7 years since the accident. 7 long years of waiting for answers that never came. The military had called it an unrecoverable loss, a phrase that sounded cold and distant. They said there was no trace of the plane, no signal, no sign, just gone, like he had vanished into the clouds and taken her heart with him. But lately, strange things had been happening. A few nights ago, the old radio in the living room had turned on by itself. It had crackled, hissed, and then she thought she heard something, just a few faint words. A voice, familiar, too familiar. She had told herself it was a glitch, interference from a nearby station. But deep inside, something in her refused to let it go. That morning she decided to test it again. She turned the dial slowly, moving through the static. Nothing, just noise. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something waiting on the other end of that static. Something she couldn't see but could somehow sense. Then Noah came down the stairs, rubbing his eyes. "You're listening to that old thing again?" he asked, his voice still sleepy. Linda smiled faintly. "Just checking if it still works," he laughed. "You've checked it every day this week." "Maybe I'm hoping it'll surprise me," she said. He didn't understand what she meant, and she didn't expect him to. He was too young when it happened to remember much. To him, his father was just a story, one told through photos and old memories. But for her, he was still everywhere. That afternoon, Linda had errands to run. She asked Noah to stay home and finish his homework. "I'll be back in an hour," she said as she grabbed her coat. "Don't forget to lock the door." When she came back later, the first thing she noticed was the open front door. Her heart jumped. "Noah?" she called, no answer. She rushed inside, her pulse quickening. The house was quiet, but the radio was on, crackling loudly, the dial glowing a faint orange. "Noah," she shouted again. "I'm here, Mom," came his voice from the living room. She found him sitting on the couch, his eyes wide and pale. "What happened? Why's the door open?" she asked, breathing fast. He pointed to the radio. Mom, you need to hear this. She frowned and stepped closer. What do you mean? He turned up the volume. The static grew sharper, but underneath it there was something else. A man's voice, faint but clear enough to understand. Linda, if you can hear me. I'm sorry. Linda froze. Her entire body went cold. What did you just say? She whispered. It said your name, Noah said. It's been repeating it for a few minutes. Her hands trembled as she knelt beside the radio. The sound faded for a second, then came back again. Linda, I don't know if this message will reach you. Tell Noah I love him. Tell him to be brave. Her breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be. It just couldn't. She turned off the radio quickly, her heart racing. No, this is impossible. Mom, who is that? Noah asked, his face full of confusion. She couldn't answer. The voice, the rhythm, the tone, it was him. It was her husband. She would have known it anywhere. But that made no sense. He was gone. There was no way a man lost for 7 years could suddenly speak through an old radio. She sat there in silence for a long time. Noah tried to ask again, but she didn't respond. Her mind was spinning too fast. Finally, she whispered, It's your father. Noah's eyes widened. That's not funny, Mom. I'm not joking, she said quietly. That's his voice. He stared at her, unsure if he should believe it. But when he saw the look in her eyes, something inside him changed. He sat down beside her. What does it mean? He asked. I don't know, she said softly. Maybe it's a recording. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but it said your name, Noah said. It said mine too, she didn't reply. The house felt different now, like something unseen had entered. That night she couldn't sleep. Every sound made her jump. She thought about calling someone, maybe the airbase, but what could she even say? That her dead husband's voice came through the radio? They'd think she'd lost her mind. The next morning she tried to act normal. She made breakfast, sent Noah to school, and pretended everything was fine. But as soon as he left, she turned the radio back on. She sat there for hours waiting. At first, there was nothing but static. Then around noon, she heard it again, softer this time. If you're hearing this, I need you to know I never stopped trying. I did everything I could to come home. Tears filled her eyes. Her hands covered her mouth. The message continued in pieces, fading in and out like a fragile memory. I crashed. Island. No signal. Tell Noah I'm proud. Then it stopped. She sat frozen, staring at the radio as the static hummed quietly. Every word echoed in her head. Island. No signal. Crash. What if he had survived? What if all these years he had been trying to reach them? That night when Noah came home, she played it for him. He listened, his face pale but calm. When it ended, he looked at her and said, We have to find out where this is coming from. Linda hesitated. What if it's not real? What if it is? He said firmly. What if he's alive? His words made her heart skip. She wanted to believe it. She wanted to believe that the man she loved had somehow made it through. But she was also terrified of hope. Because if it wasn't true, she'd be breaking her heart all over again. Still, she couldn't ignore it anymore. The next day, she drove to the nearest airbase. The officers listened politely as she told her story, but she could tell they didn't believe her. Sometimes old frequencies pick up archived transmissions, one of them said gently. It's not uncommon, but this isn't archived, she said. He mentioned our son. He said my name. The officer sighed. Ma'am, I understand how hard this is, but please don't let false hope hurt you again. She left the base in tears, feeling foolish for even coming. But that night when she got home, she turned on the radio again, and there it was. The voice, clearer than ever. I won't stop trying, Linda. I'll find a way. She fell to her knees, crying as the static swallowed the words again. It didn't matter what anyone else believed. She knew that voice. She knew it better than her own heartbeat. Somewhere, somehow, he was still out there. And now she was determined to find out how. The road wound through the mountains like a long ribbon, twisting between valleys covered in thick green forest. The air grew colder with every mile, and fog drifted across the road in thin sheets. Linda sat in the driver's seat, her eyes focused on the path ahead while Noah looked out the window, his headphones resting around his neck but no music playing. It had been 2 days since they left home. chasing the strange coordinates that seemed to match the area where the mysterious radio signal had come from. Neither of them really knew what they were looking for. But after hearing the pilot's message again, after seeing how the retired pilot Henry had reacted, Linda couldn't just sit at home anymore. Something deep inside told her this was the place where she would find answers. Maybe not the ones she wanted, but answers nonetheless. By evening, they reached a small mountain town. The streets were quiet, lined with wooden houses and tiny shops. A layer of mist hung low, making everything look softer and older. They stopped at a diner near the main road to eat and warm up. The woman behind the counter greeted them kindly, noticing how tired they looked. Over coffee and soup, Linda asked her if she had ever heard of an old plane crash nearby. The woman thought for a moment and said, "There have been a few over the years, but there's one people still talk about. A small military plane went down during a storm a long time ago. The search teams never found much. Just some burnt pieces and a parachute that got stuck in a tree." Linda's hands tightened around her cup. "Do you know where that was?" she asked. The woman nodded slowly. "A few miles north of here, near the old forest line. It's deep and dangerous terrain. Nobody goes there now. Locals call it Echo Valley because radio signals act strange up there." That name made Linda's heart skip. Echo Valley. It sounded like the kind of place where a message might bounce through time, stuck between mountains, waiting for someone to hear it. The next morning, they met two local volunteers who helped with rescue operations in the region. They were both kind men, older, used to mountain work. One of them, named Tom, agreed to guide them as far as the trail would allow. "After that, you'll have to go on foot," he said. "The path gets narrow and rough, but if that's really where the signal came from, it'll be near the ridge." They set out with backpacks, flashlights, and enough supplies for the day. The first few hours were peaceful. Birds called from the trees and the morning sun broke through the mist. But as they climbed higher, the forest thickened and the air grew cooler. Every step made the sound of crunching leaves and distant echoes of movement. Linda kept glancing at the small portable radio she carried, scanning frequencies as they walked. Most of the time there was nothing but static, but once in a while a faint pulse of sound came through, a small beep, like a heartbeat in the air. By afternoon, the sky darkened. Clouds rolled over the peaks and the wind began to whistle through the trees. Tom stopped and looked around. "We're close," he said, pointing toward a steep incline covered in moss and fallen branches. "Up there's an old cabin. It used to belong to rangers back in the day. If your husband's plane went down anywhere near here, that's where the searchers would have checked." They climbed slowly, helping each other over rocks and tree roots. Noah slipped once, catching himself on a branch. "You okay?" Linda called, breathing hard. He nodded, brushing dirt from his hands. "I'm fine. Just don't tell Mom I almost fell," he joked weakly. She laughed, even though her voice shook. The moment felt human, fragile and real. When they finally reached the ridge, the forest opened up to a small clearing. There, half hidden under ivy and fallen branches, stood a wooden cabin. It looked old, maybe decades abandoned. The door hung crooked on one hinge and the windows were fogged with grime. Still, it was standing, as if waiting for someone to return. Linda's heart pounded as she stepped inside. The air was cold and smelled of dust and rain. There were old chairs, a table, and some broken tools scattered around. But what caught her eye was a small radio set sitting on the table, still wired to a cracked battery pack. She moved closer and saw the same call sign etched into the side. D. Hayes. Her hand trembled as she touched it. The metal was rusted but intact. Noah joined her, staring in disbelief. This was his," she whispered. "He was here." Tom shined his flashlight around the room. "There's something else," he said. In the corner, under an old tarp, was a torn pilot jacket, the fabric weathered but the name patch still clear. CPT D. Hayes. Linda dropped to her knees and held the jacket close to her chest. Tears filled her eyes. The silence in the cabin was heavy, broken only by the wind outside. It felt as if time had stopped. For years she had lived between hope and loss, never knowing which to believe. Now she had proof that he had survived the crash, at least for a while. Noah crouched beside her. "He was really here," he said softly, his voice shaking. She nodded, wiping her face. "He must have tried to send the message from this radio," she said. "Maybe it still works. She checked the transmitter carefully. Most of it was dead, but a small red light blinked weakly. She turned one of the knobs and a faint hum filled the room. Static crackled, then a sound. Soft, broken words repeating again and again. It was the same voice from home. The same message. "This is Captain D. Hayes. If anyone hears this, tell my family I'm alive." The recording looped, faint but clear. Noah covered his mouth, tears spilling down his face. Linda pressed her hand over the speaker and whispered, "I hear you, David. I hear you." Tom stepped back, lowering his flashlight. "He must have set this up before he tried to leave," he said quietly. He was hoping someone would find it. As the sun began to fade behind the mountains, the forest outside turned gold and dark at the same time. They sat in silence, letting the moment sink in. For Linda, it wasn't just discovery, it was connection. The message had crossed time, distance, storms, and silence to reach her. It was proof of love and strength that refused to fade. Before leaving, Linda carefully folded the jacket and placed it in her bag. She took one last look at the cabin and whispered, "We found you." Then she turned off the weak transmitter, leaving behind the quiet hum of the forest. The hike back was slow and silent. The fog grew thicker and the path seemed endless. But for the first time in years, Linda felt peace. She didn't know what the next step would be or if she'd ever find out exactly what happened to David. But she knew one thing. For sure he had fought to stay alive long, enough to send a message that finally reached her. As they reached the bottom of the trail, Noah looked up at the darkening sky. "Mom," he said softly, "you think he was trying to lead us here?" Linda smiled through her tears. "I think he never stopped trying to come home." The sound of wind filled the valley, echoing softly through the trees, almost like a voice carried on the air. And in that quiet moment, it felt like the mountain itself was whispering back to them. The news of the discovery spread faster than Linda had expected. Once she and Noah reported the old cabin and handed over the items to the authorities. A full team from the Air Force and Rescue Department arrived at the mountain site. They sealed off the area and began examining everything: the torn jacket, the transmitter, and the journals they found inside the metal box. Linda stood nearby as they worked, her hands buried in her coat pockets, watching with quiet disbelief as people in uniforms combed through the place that had once felt frozen in time. Days later, she and Noah were called to the local airbase. An officer met them in a quiet room, holding a folder filled with documents and photographs. His voice was calm, careful, the way people speak when they have to deliver something heavy. "Mrs. Hayes," he began, "what you found was indeed your husband's survival cabin. Our technicians confirmed that the transmitter you discovered was transmitting on a low-frequency loop for years, possibly decades. It only recently began to break through again due to changes in weather and signal interference." Linda swallowed hard. "So the message we heard, that was him?" "Yes," the officer said softly. "Your husband recorded it himself. It wasn't just a routine transmission, it was personal. He made sure that if anyone ever heard it, it would reach you." Noah looked down at the table. His fingers tapped nervously as he asked, Did he survive for a long time after the crash?" The officer opened the folder and showed them a weathered notebook. "We believe so. Based on his journal, he lived for several months, possibly longer. He wrote about the crash, his injuries, and his efforts to send out a message. He even described how he repaired the radio with scraps from the wreckage." Linda's eyes filled with tears. She reached out to touch the journal but stopped halfway, afraid it might crumble. "He was always good with his hands," she whispered. "He could fix anything." The officer nodded and carefully handed her a small envelope. "There's more. Inside this you'll find something your husband left behind. It's a letter addressed to you and your son." Linda took the envelope with trembling hands. It was old and faded, the ink smudged but still readable. She hesitated, then opened it. The letter was short, written in David's firm handwriting. It said, "If this reaches you, then I did what I promised. I found a way to tell you I never stopped fighting to come home. Don't let the silence fool you. Love doesn't disappear. It just changes shape. Tell our boy I'm proud of him, and that I was thinking of you both every single day." Linda pressed the paper to her chest. Her tears fell silently onto the page. For 6 long years she had lived between doubt and faith, between wanting to move on and being unable to. Now the words she had longed for were right there, written in her husband's own hand. The officer gave them time alone. Noah moved closer to his mother, wrapping his arm around her. "He didn't stop trying, Mom," he said softly. "He really tried." She nodded, unable to speak. The air in the room felt heavy but warm in a strange way. It wasn't closure, not exactly, but it was peace. That evening, back at their hotel, Linda spread everything out on the bed: the journal, the letter, the torn jacket. She turned the pages carefully, reading through David's words. The entry started with details about the crash, how the storm hit suddenly, how the engines failed, and how he managed to eject before the plane went down. Later entries described his injuries, the struggle to survive, the loneliness. But woven through it all were messages of hope. He wrote about his family constantly, about the thought of returning home, about the sound of Linda's laughter that he said he could still hear in the wind. As she read, Noah sat beside her, listening quietly. "He was stronger than anyone I've ever known," she said after a while. "Even when he was alone, he never gave up." Noah nodded. "I think he left this so we'd never forget that." The next day, the authorities invited Linda to join the final recovery mission. They planned to search the nearby ridge that David mentioned in his last journal entry, the place he had written he would try to reach when he realized rescue wasn't coming. She hesitated at first. The thought of seeing the site where his journey ended made her chest tighten, but she knew she had to go. The group hiked for hours through dense forest and steep slopes. The wind carried the scent of pine and damp soil. As they climbed, Linda noticed how quiet everything was, as if the mountain itself remembered. Near sunset, they reached a narrow ledge overlooking the valley. One of the searchers called out, and everyone gathered around. There, under a layer of moss and earth, they found fragments of fabric and metal, the remnants of a parachute and gear. It was clear that David had made it this far before collapsing from exhaustion. Linda knelt beside the spot and closed her eyes. She didn't cry this time. Instead, she whispered, "You made it further than anyone believed. You did your best and you found a way back to us." She placed her hand gently on the ground as if touching him one last time. That night, back in town, the news channels began to share the story. They called it "The Message That Crossed Time." Reporters spoke of the pilot who survived against all odds, the message that traveled years through static, and the family who never stopped listening. But for Linda and Noah, it wasn't about news or attention. It was about the simple truth that love had outlasted loss. In the weeks that followed, Linda stayed in touch with the Air Force officials. They returned the recovered items to her, a few tools, part of the transmitter, and David's flight badge. She placed them all in a small wooden box and kept it on the shelf beside the old radio at home. Sometimes late at night, she would turn the dial and listen to the soft static again. It didn't scare her anymore. It reminded her that somewhere out there across time and distance, her husband had spoken words meant only for her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Noah came into the room holding a small photo of his father in uniform. "Mom," he said, "I've been thinking. Maybe we should make a recording, our own message. Something to keep his voice company." Linda smiled through tears. "That's a beautiful idea," she said. Together, they recorded a short message on her phone and played it through the radio. It was simple, just her saying, "We heard you. We're okay. We love you." The words faded into the static, blending with the hum of the airwaves carried away into the same sky he once flew through. For a long moment, they both sat in silence. Then Linda turned to her son and said, "Your father always said the sky never really ends. I think now I understand what he meant." Outside, the night grew quiet and the stars began to appear one by one. In that stillness, the sound of the old radio filled the room, a gentle reminder that some messages never fade. They just wait to be heard again. The morning of the memorial was quiet. A soft wind moved through the airbase, carrying the smell of jet fuel mixed with spring flowers that volunteers had placed along the walkway. The sky was clear, painted with gentle shades of blue and gold, the kind of sky David always said was perfect for flying. Linda stood near the entrance, her hands clutching a small folded piece of paper. Her heart felt heavy, but for the first time in years, it wasn't because of grief. It was something gentler, a calm that came from finally knowing the truth. Noah stood beside her, taller now, wearing a dark suit that made him look older than his age. He hadn't said much that morning, but his quiet strength reminded her so much of his father. As they walked toward the ceremony area, they saw the crowd already gathered. Pilots in uniform, reporters, and families of other soldiers. Everyone knew the story by now. The pilot's message, they called it. But for Linda, it wasn't about headlines or admiration. It was simply about love, about one man's determination to keep his promise to his family, even when the world thought he was gone. A stage had been set up near the hangar, decorated with photos from David's service. One showed him smiling beside his plane, his helmet tucked under his arm. Another showed him holding Noah as a baby, both of them laughing. There was also a display case containing the old transmitter, the jacket, and a copy of his final letter. Seeing them there made Linda's chest ache, but she felt proud. Everything that had once felt lost now had meaning. When the commander of the base took the podium, he spoke with emotion in his voice. Today we honor a man who showed us that courage doesn't end when the mission does. Captain David Hayes' story reminds us that hope can travel farther than any aircraft ever could. His message, carried through time, reached not only his family but countless hearts around the world. People clapped softly, many wiping their eyes. Then the commander turned to Linda and Noah. And today we also honor the family who never stopped believing. Mrs. Hayes, would you and your son please join us? Linda felt her hands shake as she stood, but Noah gently placed his hand on her arm. Together they walked up to the stage. The commander handed Linda a medal, a golden emblem engraved with wings and David's name. For his bravery and enduring spirit, he said. Linda nodded, her throat tight. She stepped to the microphone, unfolding the small paper she had been holding. Her voice trembled at first, but as she began to speak, it grew steadier. I used to think that loss meant the end of a story, she said, but I've learned that sometimes it's only the middle. For years I waited for a voice I thought I'd never hear again, and when I finally did, it wasn't just my husband's voice. It was a reminder that love doesn't fade just because someone is gone. It changes, it moves, and if you listen closely, it still speaks. She paused, looking out at the crowd. David's message found its way home after years of silence. Maybe that was his final mission, to remind us all that hope never really dies. To anyone out there still waiting for someone, still listening for that voice, don't stop believing. Sometimes the message you're waiting for is already on its way. When she stepped back, there was a long moment of quiet before the crowd began to clap. Noah looked at her with pride in his eyes. Then he took her place at the microphone. His hand shook slightly, but his voice was clear. My dad was a pilot, he said. But more than that, he was a man who kept his promise. Even when he couldn't come home, he found a way to reach us. I used to be angry at the world for taking him, but now I realize he never really left. He taught me what it means to keep going, to stay strong, and to believe in something bigger than fear. I'm proud to be his son. People stood and applauded. Some of the pilots saluted, their faces solemn but full of respect. As the national anthem played, the Air Force jets soared overhead in formation, their engines roaring through the sky. The sound was powerful, shaking the air and hearts alike. Linda lifted her eyes to the planes, tears glimmering in them, and whispered under her breath, "Fly high, love. You made it home." After the ceremony ended, people came to shake her hand, some offering words of comfort, others simply saying thank you. But Linda's mind was somewhere else. She kept thinking about the old radio sitting at home on the shelf, silent now but never forgotten. It had carried her through the darkest years of her life, becoming the bridge between despair and hope. That evening, back at their house, the sunset painted everything in gold. The radio sat quietly by the window just as it always had. Linda walked over, running her fingers along its worn surface. She could still remember the exact moment she heard the voice for the first time, how it had shaken her to the core, but now instead of fear or confusion, there was gratitude. She turned the dial gently. Static filled the room for a few seconds, soft and familiar. Noah came in, still wearing his suit, but with his tie loose around his neck. "You're listening again?" he asked with a small smile. "Just for a minute," she said. "It's strange. I know there won't be another message, but it feels wrong not to listen." He sat beside her, leaning his head back on the chair. "You think he can hear us?" he asked quietly. Linda smiled faintly. "I think he always could." The radio crackled softly. Nothing more. Just the quiet hum of life continuing. Linda leaned back, closing her eyes. "You know," she said, "your father always used to say the sky was full of stories. I never understood what he meant until now." Noah turned to her. Maybe he was right. Maybe some stories never end, they just keep flying. She reached for his hand and squeezed it. And maybe love is one of them. Outside, the last light of day faded behind the horizon. The stars began to appear, tiny and bright against the darkening blue. Somewhere far above, the same sky stretched endlessly. The sky David had once flown through. The sky that had carried his final message home. Linda stood up and walked to the mantel, where David's flight badge rested beside a framed photograph of their family. She placed the medal beside it, arranging it carefully. Then she whispered, "We did it, love. Your voice reached us." As she stood there, Noah joined her. They didn't need to say anything. The silence between them was full of meaning. The years of waiting, of pain and wondering had finally found peace. The message that had once been a mystery was now a memory, a gift that would never fade. Before going to bed, Linda glanced once more at the radio. The light on it glowed faintly, reflecting the stars outside. It was just a machine, but to her it was more than that. It was proof that even across time, distance, and silence, love had found a way to speak. That night, Linda dreamed of flying, not in a plane, but in the open sky, surrounded by clouds and light. She saw David smiling at her, reaching out his hand. She didn't feel sad anymore. When she woke up, the first thing she heard was the gentle morning wind, moving through the trees outside. It sounded almost like a whisper, soft and kind, like a message carried on the breeze. And as the day began, she smiled, knowing that some goodbyes aren't the end. They're just another way of saying, "I'm still here,